and Boleyn's story has fascinated and horrified generations. She was not just another queen consort who faded quietly into the background of history. She was a woman who dared to challenge convention, who stood beside Henry VIII in his most radical decisions, and who ultimately paid for it all with her life. Her rise and fall are among the most dramatic tales of the Tudor dynasty, capturing ambition, betrayal, humiliation, and the brutal realities of power. Born around 1501, and was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a skilled diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, from one of England's most powerful families. She spent part of her youth in the Netherlands and later in France, serving at the courts of Archduchess Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude. These years abroad gave her sophistication, fluency in languages, and the refined manners that would later captivate Henry VIII. Unlike many women of her station, she was highly educated, witty, and confident. In a court culture where charm and intelligence could be as valuable as beauty, and Boleyn had all three. When she returned to England in the 1520s, she quickly attracted attention. At first, she was linked to Henry Percy, heir to the Earl of Northumberland, but that romance was broken off likely because of her family's ambitions and Cardinal Wolsey's intervention. It wasn't long before she entered the service of Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. Here, she caught the king's eye. By the mid-1520s, Henry was infatuated with her, but was no ordinary mistress. Unlike many before her, she refused to become Henry's lover without the promise of marriage. This was bold, even dangerous. Henry was already married to Catherine of Aragon, and the marriage had lasted for nearly 2 decades. But Catherine had not given him a surviving male heir, and Henry's desperation for a son became the perfect opening for Anne. She positioned herself not just as an object of desire, but as a future queen. Henry's obsession with Anne ignited a chain of events that would transform England forever. The Pope refused to grant Henry an annulment from Catherine, and so Henry broke with Rome, creating the Church of England, and became the symbol of this seismic religious and political shift. In 1533, she and Henry were married in secret, and later that year, she was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony. Her triumph, however, quickly became a struggle, and gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, in September 1533. While Elizabeth would later become one of England's greatest monarchs, Henry at the time saw only disappointment. He longed for a son to secure his dynasty. Two further pregnancies ended in miscarriage, one in 1536 after the death of Henry's first wife Catherine of Aragon, a cruel irony that seemed to seal Anne's fate, and was never a passive queen. She involved herself in politics, supported reformist religious figures, and had sharp opinions. But her assertiveness, which once attracted Henry, soon began to work against her. Many at court resented her, including those loyal to Catherine of Aragon and her daughter, Mary. The old nobility saw her family, the Boleyns, as upstarts who had risen to height quickly. Anne's enemies whispered against her, waiting for an opportunity to strike. By early 1536, Henry's attention had shifted to Jane Seymour, a quieter and more compliant lady-in-waiting. For Anne, this was the beginning of the end. When she miscarried again in January, reports spread that the lost child had been a boy. Henry saw this as both a personal betrayal and a sign from God that their marriage was cursed. Not long after, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, moved to destroy her. Whether motivated by politics, Henry's desires, or his own rivalry with Anne, Cromwell orchestrated a case that would ensure her downfall. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges against her were shocking: adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George Boleyn, incest, and treason. The accusations were thin, but they served their purpose. The trial was less about justice than about removing a queen who had lost her usefulness, and faced her trial in the Great Hall of the Tower before a jury of peers, many of whom were her enemies or under the king's influence. Witnesses gave testimony, but much of it was hearsay or fabricated. and defended herself eloquently. But it was futile. The verdict was predetermined. She was found guilty of all charges, and the sentence was death, her body to be either burned or beheaded at the king's discretion. Henry, perhaps out of a twisted sense of mercy, chose beheading by sword rather than the axe. This was considered a cleaner and quicker death, and he even sent for an executioner from Calais, known for his skill. For Anne, it was a small concession in the face of utter humiliation. She had once been the most powerful woman in England, crowned and celebrated, but now she was condemned as a traitor, an adulteress, paraded as an example of disgrace. On May 19, 1536, and walked to the scaffold within the Tower grounds. Dressed in a gown of dark gray or black, she addressed the small crowd that had gathered. She did not confess to the crimes charged against her, but instead praised the king, asking God to protect him and England. Her speech was dignified, humble, and calculated to ensure her daughter, Elizabeth, would not be punished further by her disgrace. Then, kneeling upright without a block, she prepared for the sword. In a single stroke, her head was severed from her body. The crowd was stunned into silence. The execution was swift, but the fall was immense, and Boleyn, once Queen of England, had been reduced to a cautionary tale. Her body and head were placed in an arrow chest and buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower chapel. Anne's death was not simply the end of a queen, it was a political act meant to erase her influence, destroy the Boleyn faction, and clear the way for Henry to marry Jane Seymour. But Anne's legacy did not vanish with her. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would go on to rule England for more than 40 years, becoming the iconic Queen Elizabeth I. This is where part 1 of Anne Boleyn's story leaves us, with her dramatic rise, her catastrophic fall, and her brutal execution in 1536. But her story does not end at the scaffold. The aftermath of her death reshaped Tudor politics, religion, and dynastic struggles in ways that echoed through English history. And Boleyn's execution may have ended her life, but it ignited consequences far beyond the bloody morning in May 1536. Henry VIII wasted no time. Within just days of Anne's death, he married Jane Seymour. To many, it seemed a confirmation that the entire case against Anne had been engineered to rid Henry of Anne, inconvenient wife, so that he could try again for a male heir. The swiftness with which Henry replaced her only deepened the sense of betrayal and ruthlessness surrounding her fate. Yet despite Henry's efforts to bury her memory, Anne's presence lingered. Her daughter Elizabeth was still just a child when her mother was executed, declared illegitimate and stripped of her title as princess. For years, Elizabeth lived in the shadow of her mother's disgrace, her position uncertain. But in time, Elizabeth would reclaim Anne's legacy in the most extraordinary way, ascending the throne in 1558. As Elizabeth I, one of England's most celebrated monarchs, the woman once branded as a traitor and adulteress had given birth to a queen who would define an era, and story became woven into the larger fabric of Tudor politics and religion. She had been a driving force behind Henry's break with Rome, not simply as a lover who refused to yield, but as a patron of reformist thinkers and religious change. Her influence had encouraged Henry to pursue the annulment from Catherine of Aragon, leading to the creation of the Church of England. Though her enemies painted her as manipulative, many reformers remembered her as a protector of those seeking freedom from papal authority. To them, Anne was not just a queen who fell, she was a martyr of sorts for a new religious order. But the narratives surrounding her were complex, shaped by bias, politics, and legend. To Catholic chroniclers, Anne was a schemer whose ambition destroyed a queen and fractured Christendom. To Protestants, she was sometimes remembered more sympathetically as a queen whose downfall was the price of her religious convictions. Over time, historians and storytellers continue to wrestle with the truth of who Anne really was: a cunning opportunist, an innocent victim, or a woman undone by the impossible expectations placed upon her. Her execution also revealed the brutal nature of Tudor justice. Trials in this era were often spectacles of power rather than genuine searches for truth. The accusations against Anne incest, adultery, treason were not just exaggerated, but implausible, involving supposed lovers in places and times that made little sense. But such details mattered little when Henry's will was the true law of the land. Anne's conviction was a warning. No one, not even a queen, could stand in the way of the king's desires, even in death, and captured the imagination of poets, chroniclers, and later dramatists. Her story was retold in ballads, whispered in courtly gossip, and eventually immortalized in plays, novels, and films. Generations found in her tale a mirror of themes that never grow old: love, betrayal, power, ambition, and injustice, whether vilified or vindicated, and became a symbol of the dangers faced by women who sought influence in a world ruled by men. The physical reminders of and remain scattered, but significant. Within the Tower of London, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula still holds her remains, buried without ceremony, yet now marked as a site of remembrance. Visitors pause there, reflecting on the woman who lost her head at the very heart of England. As most notorious fortress, her portrait, too, gazes out from gallery walls. Her dark eyes are a reminder of the queen whose allure changed history and popular culture. And Boleyn endures as perhaps the most famous of Henry VI's wives. The rhyme divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survive captures the grim fate of the Tudor queens. But it is Anne's story that seems to stand apart. She was not simply beheaded, she was destroyed in a spectacle of calculated political theater. And yet, through Elizabeth, she achieved a form of immortality that Henry himself could never have foreseen. When Elizabeth ascended the throne, she wore the legacy of her mother like a hidden crown. Though Elizabeth rarely spoke openly of Anne, she did surround herself with many who had once been loyal to her mother. She also cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen, free from the fate of marriage that had destroyed her mother and other Tudor queens. In ruling alone, Elizabeth avoided the entanglements of male dominance and reshaped the monarchy in her own image. It was, in many ways, the ultimate vindication of Anne's life. Her daughter achieved the glory that in herself had been denied. Centuries later, Anne's story still resonates. She has been remembered as a victim of tyranny, a dangerous temptress, a religious reformer, and a tragic heroine. Each generation reshapes her image to reflect its own values. But what remains constant is the power of her tale. Few figures from history embody so clearly the intersection of love, politics, religion, and death. Her fall reminds us of the perilous stakes of life at court, where a woman's worth could rise or collapse with a king's desire. It also forces us to confront the ways in which history treats women, who step outside the bounds of expectation. And Boleyn dared to defy convention, and though it cost her life, it also ensured her a place in history that endures long after her enemies' names have faded. Today, when we speak of Boleyn, we do not only remember a queen who lost her head. We remember the woman whose intelligence and ambition changed the course of English history, who gave birth to a daughter that would become one of the greatest monarchs in the world, and whose story continues to fascinate nearly 500 years later. If Anne's rise and fall tell us anything, it is that power and love in the hands of kings are rarely merciful, but history sometimes grants the justice denied in life. And Boleyn, condemned as a traitor, stands now as a figure of resilience, intrigue, and tragic grandeur, a reminder that even in the shadows of betrayal and execution, a legacy can endure. If you found Boleyn's story as compelling as countless others have across centuries, don't forget to share this with others who appreciate history as darkest and most powerful tales. Subscribe for more stories that uncover the betrayals, executions, and unforgettable legacies of those who shaped our world.